All right. Day 75, and we're revisiting these opioid and cannabinoid receptors.
Okay.
You're looking for a deeper dive into their signaling pathways, especially how they relate to analgesia reward and even immunomodulation.
Right.
We've got a lot to unpack, but with the sources you've provided, I think we can really map out these pathways and hit those key nodes you're interested in.
Yeah, definitely.
So maybe we can start with a quick overview just to kind of set the stage.
Sure.
What are opioid and cannabinoid receptors, and what do they actually do?
Well, the fascinating thing is they're both types of G protein coupled receptors, or GPCRs.
Okay, I've heard of those.
They're essentially like gatekeepers on the surface of cells, waiting for the right signal to activate them and trigger a cascade of events inside the cell.
So they're not just sitting there passively, they're actively waiting for a signal to kick things off.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's talk about those signals then. I know these receptors respond to the body's own naturally produced molecules, right?
You got it.
What are those called again?
Endogenous ligands. And they really are like keys fitting into specific locks.
Okay, I like that analogy.
For opioid receptors, think endorphins, enkephalins, and dynorphins. Those are our internal pain relievers and mood boosters.
Own natural painkillers.
Exactly. Then on the cannabinoid side, we have anandamide and 2-AG, which are the body's own cannabis-like molecules.
So we've got these receptors primed and ready, and the body has its own set of keys to activate them.
Right.
But how do they actually control pain and create those feelings of euphoria? What's happening at the cellular level when these ligands bind?
It all goes back to that cascade effect I mentioned.
The domino effect.
Exactly. When a ligand binds, it sets off this chain reaction inside the cell. The ligand binds, the G protein is activated, and that triggers a signaling cascade that ultimately changes how neurons communicate with each other.
So it's not just an on-off switch, but this whole series of events that change how we perceive pain and even influence our mood.
It's a complex process, but really fascinating.
This is where it gets really interesting though, right? Because both of these systems, opioids and cannabinoids, have this darker side to them, tolerance and addiction.
Yeah, that's a crucial aspect to consider.
So let's break those down.
Okay.
Let's start with tolerance. What's happening at the cellular level that leads to tolerance?
Well, it turns out that with repeated activation, the cells actually become less responsive to those ligands.
So they're getting used to the signal.
Right. It's like they're getting used to it, and they need a stronger dose to achieve the same effect.
The body's trying to maintain balance.
Absolutely. It's adapting to this flood of signals and adjusting accordingly.
Okay, that makes sense.
Huh.
What about addiction then? How does that fit into this picture?
Addiction really boils down to the reward pathways in the brain, specifically a region called the mesolimbic dopamine system.
I've heard of that.
It's involved in pleasure motivation and reinforcement. It's what makes us feel good and drives us to repeat those behaviors that bring us pleasure.
So how do opioids and cannabinoids hijack this system?
Both opioid and cannabinoid receptors can modulate dopamine release in this reward pathway.
So they're tapping into that pleasure center.
Exactly. And when they're repeatedly activated, they can lead to changes in dopamine signaling, which creates those intense cravings and compulsive drug-seeking behavior we see in addiction.
So the drug is basically short-circuiting the brain's natural reward system, making it crave more and more of that artificial stimulation.
That's a good way to put it. And what's really fascinating is that these systems don't operate in isolation. They interact with other neurotransmitters in the brain.
Right, we can't think of them as these separate silos.
Exactly. There's this intricate crosstalk happening between opioid and cannabinoid receptors and other neurotransmitters like dopamine, serotonin, and GABA. They all influence each other, contributing to the complex effects we see with these drugs.
Okay, so we've talked about pain, pleasure, and addiction.
Right.
But there's another layer to this, isn't it there? You mentioned immunomodulation earlier. What's that all about?
This is where things get really interesting. Both opioid and cannabinoid receptors are actually found on immune cells.
Wait, really?
Yeah, which suggests they're playing a role in modulating the immune response.
So on top of everything else, these receptors are influencing how our bodies fight off infections and control inflammation. That's incredible.
It is. It really highlights how interconnected these systems are and how much we still have to learn.
It seems like they're involved in so many different aspects of our health. Where do we even begin to unravel all of this?
Well, let's start by looking at the specific mechanisms of action for each receptor type.
Okay, let's do that.
Opioid receptors, particularly the new opioid receptor, are the primary target for pain relief. They're strategically positioned throughout the central nervous system in the spinal cord brainstem and areas of the brain involved in processing emotions and rewards.
So they're positioned to intercept pain signals at multiple levels.
Exactly.
How do they actually block those signals?
Yeah, when an opioid ligand, like an endorphin or a drug like morphine, binds to the mu-opioid receptor, it sets off a cascade of events that ultimately inhibit the transmission of pain signals.
Okay, so they're interfering with pain transmission somehow.
Right. One way they do this is by modulating ion channels, which are responsible for the electrical signals that neurons use to communicate.
So the opioid receptor is somehow influencing the flow of ions across the neuron's membrane.
Exactly. When activated, the mu-opioid receptor can inhibit the opening of calcium channels, which are essential for the release of neurotransmitters involved in pain signaling.
So less calcium, fewer pain signals.
Right. It can also enhance the opening of potassium channels, which hyperpolarizes the neuron, making it less likely to fire and transmit a pain signal.
So it's like a two-pronged approach, reducing the release of pain signaling neurotransmitters and making the neuron less excitable overall.
Precisely. And this happens at multiple levels of the pain pathway. From the spinal cord, where the initial pain signals are processed, all the way up to the brain, where pain perception and emotional responses are generated.
It's like a multi-level attack on pain. But as we discussed, there's that potential downside of tolerance and addiction with opioids. What about cannabinoids? How do they fit into the pain relief picture?
Cannabinoid receptors, especially the CB1 receptor, work a bit differently. They don't directly block pain transmission in the same way that opioid receptors do.
Interesting.
Instead, they modulate the release of other neurotransmitters that are involved in pain signaling.
So they're working behind the scenes, influencing how those other pain-related neurotransmitters are released.
Exactly. And this indirect approach might actually offer some advantages in terms of side effects. While both systems ultimately affect neurotransmitter release, cannabinoids tend to have a less direct impact on the dopamine system, which could explain why they have a lower addictive potential than opioids.
That makes sense. So while both opioids and cannabinoids can modulate pain and influence reward, they do so through slightly different mechanisms, and that translates into different risks and benefits. What about the other cannabinoid receptor, CB2? What's its role in all of this?
CB2 is particularly intriguing because it's found primarily on immune cells rather than neurons.
Oh, that's right. We talked about that earlier.
This suggests that it's playing a key role in modulating the immune response, and research is starting to uncover its potential for treating a variety of conditions, from chronic pain and inflammation to autoimmune diseases.
Okay, so we're starting to see how these receptors, both opioid and cannabinoid, are involved in more than just pain and pleasure. They're part of this intricate web of interactions that influence everything from our mood and behavior to our immune function.
It's a really complex system, but understanding how it all works together is crucial for developing effective therapies.
Speaking of complexity, I remember you mentioning something about CAMP signaling microdomains earlier. Can you explain what those are and why they're important?
Of course, CAMP is a key signaling molecule involved in the cascade of events that's triggered when a ligand binds to a GPCR. And for a long time, it was thought that CAMP just diffused freely throughout the cell. But we now know that CAMP signaling is much more organized and localized than we initially thought.
Organized, what do you mean?
It means that CAMP signaling isn't happening uniformly throughout the cell. It's confined to specific microdomains or compartments within the cell.
So it's like the cell has these designated areas where specific signaling events occur.
Exactly. These microdomains are created by a variety of factors, including the localization of receptors, signaling molecules, and scaffolding proteins. And this spatial organization is crucial for ensuring that the right signals are delivered to the right places at the right times.
That makes sense. So how do these CAMP signaling microdomains relate to opioid and cannabinoid receptors?
Both opioid and cannabinoid receptors can influence CAMP levels. For example, activation of mu-opioid receptors typically leads to a decrease in CAMP, while activation of CB1 receptors can either increase or decrease CAMP depending on the context.
I see. So they're both players in this intricate signaling network.
Exactly, and understanding how these receptors regulate CAMP signaling within specific microdomains could be key to developing more targeted and effective therapies. It's not just about activating or inhibiting the receptor, it's about understanding how that manipulation affects signaling within specific compartments of the cell.
It's about the whole picture. We
Ouais.
need to think about not just the players, but the playing field as well.
I like that analogy.
Before we move on to those therapeutic applications, though, there's one more piece I'd like to clarify. You mentioned something called kinase anchoring proteins, or AKPs.
Yes.
What are those and how do they fit into all of this?
AKPs are fascinating proteins that act as organizers, bringing together different signaling molecules into close proximity.
Okay.
They bind to specific locations within the cell, like the plasma membrane or the cytoskeleton, and then recruit other signaling molecules, including CAMP-dependent protein kinase, or pKa.
So they're like the architects of those signaling microdomains we were just talking about.
Precisely. They bring together the key players in these signaling cascades, ensuring that everything is in the right place at the right time. And this spatial organization is crucial for fine-tuning cellular responses, including those mediated by opioid and cannabinoid receptors.
Okay, so we've got these complex signaling cascades happening within specific microdomains, and AKPs are the architects ensuring that everything is organized and functioning properly.
Yeah.
That's a lot to take in, but I think we've laid a solid foundation for understanding how these receptors work at the cellular level.
I agree. Now that we have a grasp of the players in the playing field, we can start to explore the therapeutic implications of targeting these receptors for a variety of conditions.
And that's exactly where we'll pick up next time.
Sounds good. So we've talked about these receptors on a cellular level, how they work, but maybe we can zoom out a little bit.
Yeah.
Think about the bigger picture.
Oh.
One of the most, fascinating and complex areas of research is immunomodulation, this idea that these receptors can actually influence how our immune system functions.
Right, and we touched on that briefly earlier.
Yeah.
It's almost counterintuitive to think about pain receptors being involved in immunity.
Yeah.
But you're saying both opioid and cannabinoid receptors are found on immune cells.
Exactly. And this discovery really opened up a whole new avenue of research.
Okay.
For example, studies suggest that opioid receptors on immune cells can actually suppress certain immune functions.
Good.
They might inhibit the production of cytokines, those signaling molecules that are essential for coordinating the immune response.
So in a way, opioids could be dampening the immune system's ability to fight off infections.
That's possible.
That seems a bit counterproductive, especially if someone is in pain and potentially more vulnerable.
It's a delicate balance. While some degree of immune suppression might be beneficial in certain situations, like reducing excessive inflammation,
Right.
it can also have unintended consequences.
Like what? Can you give me an example?
Sure, studies have shown that patients who receive opioids after surgery might be at a higher risk of developing infections. It's thought that this is because the opioids are suppressing their immune system, making it harder for their bodies to fight off bacteria and other pathogens.
Wow, that's concerning.
Yeah.
It really highlights the importance of carefully considering the risks and benefits of using opioids, especially for patients who might already have a weakened immune system.
Right.
What about cannabinoids? How do they affect the immune system?
Cannabinoid receptors, and specifically CB2 receptors, are predominantly found on immune cells.
Okay.
And their effects on the immune system are complex, with both immune-suppressing and immune-stimulating properties, depending on the context.
So they're even more multifaceted than opioid receptors when it comes to immunomodulation.
It seems that way cannabinoids are like fine-tuners of the immune response. For example, some studies have shown that they can reduce inflammation by inhibiting the production of those pro-inflammatory cytokines we talked about.
That sounds like it could be beneficial for conditions like autoimmune diseases, where the immune system is basically attacking the body's own tissues.
Exactly, and there's growing evidence to support that idea. Research is exploring the use of cannabinoids for managing conditions like rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, and inflammatory bowel disease, all conditions with chronic inflammation driven by the immune system.
So in some cases, they might be able to suppress the immune response,
Yeah.
but you also mentioned they can have immune-stimulating effects.
That's right.
How does that work?
It seems that in certain contexts, cannabinoids can actually enhance immune function. For example, they might promote the activity of natural killer cells, which are specialized immune cells that target and destroy infected or cancerous cells.
Oh, wow. So it's not as simple as good or bad.
Right.
It really depends on the context and what specific part of the immune response is being targeted.
That's right. It's all about understanding the nuances of how these molecules interact with the immune system to produce a specific outcome.
Okay, so we've explored the immunomodulatory effects of both opioid and cannabinoid receptors, and it's clear that they play a role in this complex interplay between the nervous and immune systems. But how is this knowledge being translated into actual therapies?
Right.
How can we use this information to help people suffering from chronic pain addiction or autoimmune diseases?
That's the million-dollar question, and researchers are working hard to find answers. The potential applications are vast.
Okay.
But there are significant challenges, too.
Sure. Let's start with chronic pain. We know that opioids can be effective for pain relief, but they come with risks like tolerance addiction and those immune-suppressing effects we discussed. Could targeting the endocannabinoid system offer a safer and more sustainable approach?
That's the hope, and there's growing evidence to support it. Remember, our bodies naturally produce endocannabinoids that interact with CB1 and CB2 receptors to modulate pain, inflammation, and other physiological processes. The idea is to harness the power of the system without the downsides of opioids.
So working with the body's natural mechanisms rather than introducing external substances that can disrupt that delicate balance. What are some examples of how this is being done?
One promising avenue is the development of drugs that target specific cannabinoid receptors. For example, there are CB2 receptor agonists,
Yeah.
drugs that activate the receptor,
Right.
which can help reduce inflammation and pain. These are especially interesting because they don't seem to produce the psychoactive effects associated with CB1 receptor activation.
So you could potentially get the pain relief and anti-inflammatory benefits without the high associated with marijuana.
Exactly. Other strategies are also being explored, like developing drugs that inhibit the breakdown of endocannabinoids. This essentially boosts the body's own supply of these pain-relieving molecules.
That's fascinating. It seems like there's a lot of potential there. What about addiction? Can understanding these receptor systems help us break the cycle of dependence on opioids and other drugs?
It's a critical area of research, and it goes back to what we discussed earlier about the brain's reward pathways. Both opioid and cannabinoid receptors can influence dopamine release in those areas associated with pleasure and reinforcement. So researchers are looking for ways to interrupt those reward circuits without triggering the intense cravings and withdrawal symptoms that make overcoming addiction so difficult.
So it's about finding a way to rewire the brain's reward system. How are you trying to do that?
There are several approaches being explored. One is developing medications that block opioid receptors, reducing the rewarding effects of opioid drugs and helping to manage withdrawal symptoms. It's like providing a safety net during the detoxification process.
That makes sense. Are there other strategies?
Yes, researchers are investigating non-invasive brain stimulation techniques to modulate activity in those reward circuits. It's like hitting the reset button on the brain's reward system.
Okay, so we've talked about chronic pain and addiction. What about autoimmune diseases? How can targeting these receptors help manage those conditions?
Remember, both opioid and cannabinoid receptors can modulate immune function. And in autoimmune diseases, the immune system is essentially attacking the body's own tissues. So the idea is to use these receptors to dampen the immune response and reduce inflammation, calming the immune system down.
So it's about restoring balance to the immune system, preventing it from going into overdrive and causing harm.
Exactly. And there's evidence that both opioid and cannabinoid receptors could play a role. For example, some studies show that opioid receptor agonists can suppress the production of those pro-inflammatory cytokines involved in autoimmune responses.
And what about cannabinoids in this context?
Well, as we discussed, CB2 receptors are primarily found on immune cells and seem to have strong anti-inflammatory effects. So there's a lot of interest in developing CB2 receptor agonists as therapies for autoimmune diseases.
It seems logical that by targeting those CB2 receptors directly on immune cells, we might be able to modulate the immune response in a more targeted and effective way. Are there clinical trials underway for these types of therapies?
Absolutely. Researchers are investigating the use of CB2 receptor agonists for conditions like rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, and inflammatory bowel disease. The early results are promising, but we need more research to understand the long-term safety and efficacy of these treatments.
It's exciting to think about the potential for these new therapies. They could really improve the quality of life for millions of people living with autoimmune diseases.
It really is promising, but as always, it's important to remember that we're still in the early stages of understanding the complexity of these systems.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today. From the basic mechanisms of these receptors to their intricate roles in pain, pleasure, addiction, and immunomodulation.
Right, a lot of information.
It's amazing how much there is to learn about these tiny molecules and the powerful effects they have on our health and well-being.
It really is fascinating, and as research continues, we'll undoubtedly uncover even more about their intricate roles and therapeutic potential.
Before we wrap up this section, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier. You were talking about glycine receptors and their role in inhibiting neuronal activity. Can you explain how they fit into the larger picture? I mean, are they connected to opioid and cannabinoid receptors in any way?
Good question. Glycine receptors are also GPCRs like opioid and cannabinoid receptors. But while those receptors are involved in a wide range of functions, glycine receptors have a more specialized role. They're mainly found in the spinal cord and brainstem, where they act as inhibitory neurotransmitters.
So they're essentially putting the brakes on neuronal activity.
Exactly. When glycine binds to its receptor, it triggers the opening of chloride channels, allowing negatively charged chloride ions to flow into the neuron. This influx of negative charge hyperpolarizes the neuron, making it less likely to fire an action potential.
So it's like lowering the neuron's voltage, making it less excitable.
Precisely. This inhibitory effect is crucial for maintaining balance in the nervous system. Imagine what would happen if neurons were constantly firing without any inhibition.
Yeah, it would be total chaos.
Exactly. Signals firing uncontrollably. Glycine receptors help prevent that, ensuring that neural activity is tightly regulated. Now, while glycine receptors don't directly interact with opioid or cannabinoid receptors, they all play a role in modulating neuronal activity, just in different ways.
So they're all part of this intricate system that controls pain perception and other processes. It's a complex web of interactions with multiple players contributing to the overall outcome.
That's right. And it highlights the interconnectedness of these systems. We can't just focus on one receptor or neurotransmitter in isolation. It's the interplay between them that matters.
Okay, so we've added another piece to the puzzle. Glycine receptors, with their inhibitory role, add yet another layer of complexity to this already intricate system. But it's fascinating to see how it all comes together.
It is, and it just goes to show how much we still have to learn about these incredibly complex systems that govern our bodies.
I agree. Before we move on, can we just take a moment to recap the key takeaways from this part of our deep dive?
Sure. We started by exploring the immunomodulatory effects of both opioid and cannabinoid receptors. We discussed how they can both suppress and stimulate the immune response depending on the context, and how this knowledge is being translated into potential therapies for conditions like autoimmune diseases.
Right, and we also talked about the challenges of using opioids for chronic pain management and the exciting potential of targeting the endocannabinoid system as a safer alternative.
Exactly. And we delved into the brain's reward pathways and how both opioid and cannabinoid receptors can influence dopamine release, leading to the development of addiction.
It's clear that these receptor systems are involved in a remarkable range of processes, from pain and pleasure to immune function and even addiction.
It's truly fascinating, and the more we understand about these systems, the better equipped we'll be to develop safe and effective therapies that target these receptors.
Well, speaking of therapies, I'm eager to hear more about the specific ways that researchers are targeting these receptors to treat a variety of conditions. That's where we'll pick up in part 3, right?
Absolutely. We'll delve into some of the most cutting-edge research and explore the potential of these receptors to revolutionize how we approach healthcare.
Okay, so we've covered a ton of ground on opioid and cannabinoid receptors, their signaling pathways and how they're all tied into pain and reward and even the immune system. It's clear these receptors are involved in a whole lot more than we might initially think. So where do we go from here? How is all this knowledge actually being translated into therapies?
That's the exciting part. We're seeing a surge in research aimed at targeting these receptors for a whole variety of conditions. One area that's really taking off is using cannabinoids for pain management.
We talked about that a bit earlier, the idea of kind of harnessing the body's endocannabinoid system. But what does that look like in practice? Are there specific drugs being developed?
Yeah, definitely. As we discussed, CB2 receptors, which are mainly found on immune cells, have potent anti-inflammatory effects. So researchers are developing CB2 receptor agonists, basically drugs that activate this receptor as potential therapies for conditions like rheumatoid arthritis and inflammatory bowel disease.
So the idea is to target the inflammation right at the source, using the body's own endocannabinoid system. What about conditions like multiple sclerosis? Can these receptors play a role there too?
Yes, actually. Multiple sclerosis is an autoimmune disease where the immune system attacks the protective covering of nerve fibers. And early research suggests that CB2 receptor agonists might be able to help regulate the immune response and potentially even slow down the progression of the disease.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
It seems like these receptors hold so much promise for treating such a wide range of conditions. Are there any other therapeutic avenues being explored?
There are. Another area that's particularly intriguing is the potential for using these receptors to treat addiction.
We talk about how both opioid and cannabinoid receptors can influence the brain's reward pathways and contribute to addiction. But how can we use that knowledge to actually help people break free from that cycle of addiction?
Researchers are looking at several different approaches. One is developing medications that block opioid receptors. These medications would essentially reduce the rewarding effects of opioid drugs and help manage withdrawal symptoms, which could make it much easier for people to go through detox.
It's like providing a safety net, reducing the intensity of those cravings and withdrawal symptoms that can be so hard to overcome. Are there any other strategies being explored for addiction?
Yeah, researchers are also investigating non-invasive brain stimulation techniques that can actually modulate activity in the reward circuits. This approach is still in its early stages, but it holds a lot of promise for sort of resetting the brain's reward system and helping people overcome addiction.
That sounds almost futuristic, but it's really exciting to think about the possibilities. We've talked about pain management, autoimmune diseases, and addiction. Are there any other areas where these receptors could have a therapeutic role?
Research is ongoing in so many areas. For example, scientists are exploring the role of these receptors in mood disorders like anxiety and depression.
That makes sense considering their role in the brain's reward pathways and how closely reward is linked to mood.
Exactly. And some early evidence suggests that targeting these receptors could offer new ways to treat these conditions. It's still early days, but the research is moving forward really rapidly.
It's really incredible to think about how much progress has already been made in understanding these receptors and their potential therapeutic applications. What would you say is the most important takeaway from all of this research?
I think the key takeaway is that these receptors are incredibly complex and involved in such a vast array of processes throughout the body. And while we've made great strides in understanding them, there's still so much more to learn. The research is moving forward, though, and the potential for developing new and innovative therapies is truly immense.
It's been a fascinating deep dive today exploring this intricate world of opioid and cannabinoid receptors. It seems like we've only just scratched the surface of what these remarkable molecules are capable of.
Absolutely. And that's what makes this field so exciting. There's always more to discover, and with each new discovery comes the potential to improve human health and well-being in really profound ways. So stay tuned because this story is far from over.
That's a perfect note to end on. Thanks for taking us on this incredible journey into the world of these fascinating receptors.
It's been a pleasure. It was a great conversation.